Have you ever tried to explain yourself to someone, only to realize they didn't understand what you meant at all? Not because they weren't listening, not because they didn't care, but because somehow, the words coming out of your mouth never seemed to capture what was happening inside your head. It's a frustrating feeling. You know exactly what you're trying to say. You know exactly how you feel. Yet the moment you try to explain it, something gets lost. And when it happens enough times, a dangerous thought begins to form. Maybe nobody will ever truly understand me. Psychology suggests that this feeling is far more common than most people realize. And interestingly, it often affects people who think deeply, feel deeply, and spend a lot of time reflecting on their experiences. Most people assume feeling misunderstood means people don't care about you, but that's usually not true. In fact, many people who feel misunderstood are surrounded by people who genuinely love them. Friends, family, partners. The problem isn't always a lack of care. The problem is often a difference in perception. Every person experiences reality through their own mental filter, their own memories, their own beliefs, their own emotional experiences. When you explain something, the other person isn't hearing your experience directly. They're interpreting it through their own. And sometimes those two worlds are very different. Imagine trying to describe a color that only you can see. You know exactly what it looks like, but no matter how carefully you explain it, the other person can only imagine it through colors they've already experienced. This is often what emotional communication feels like, especially for people who have rich inner worlds. The more complex your thoughts become, the harder they can be to translate into language. This is one reason highly reflective people often feel misunderstood. They spend hours thinking about things that others process in minutes. A single conversation might stay in their mind for days. A small disagreement might trigger deeper questions about relationships, identity, or human behavior. By the time they explain what they're feeling, their mind has already connected dozens of ideas together. But to everyone else, those connections are invisible. As a result, they may hear responses like, "You're overthinking it. It's not that deep. Just let it go." Those responses are usually well-intentioned, but they often make the person feel even more misunderstood. Because the issue isn't that they're overthinking. The issue is that they're seeing layers other people aren't noticing. Another reason people feel misunderstood is that they learn to hide parts of themselves. This often starts early. Maybe they shared something important and were dismissed. Maybe they expressed strong emotions and were told they were too sensitive. Maybe they opened up and felt judged. Over time, the brain adapts. It learns that being fully honest doesn't always feel safe, so people begin sharing smaller and smaller pieces of themselves. Not because they're dishonest, but because it feels easier. Eventually, they develop a version of themselves that others understand, while the deeper parts remain hidden. And that's where the loneliness begins. Because people can only understand the version of you that you allow them to see. But here's where things become interesting. Sometimes the feeling of being misunderstood has very little to do with other people. Sometimes it comes from not fully understanding yourself. Psychologists often talk about something called self-concept, the mental picture you have of who you are. For some people, that picture is clear. For others, it's constantly changing. They're still figuring themselves out, still exploring their beliefs, still discovering what matters to them. When you don't fully understand yourself, explaining yourself to others becomes even harder. How can someone understand a story that's still being written? Think about how often people change over the course of their lives. The person you were 5 years ago isn't the same person you are today. Your values change. Your priorities change. Your understanding of the world changes. Yet many people still expect themselves to have perfectly clear answers about who they are. And when they don't, they assume something is wrong. But growth is often messy, confusing, and difficult to explain. Now consider this. What if being misunderstood isn't always a problem? What if it's simply part of being human? No two people will ever experience the world in exactly the same way. No matter how close you become, no matter how much someone loves you, there will always be parts of your experience that belong only to you. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps the goal isn't finding someone who understands every detail of your mind. Perhaps the goal is finding people who are willing to try, people who listen, people who stay curious, people who don't need perfect understanding to offer genuine connection. Because the truth is, being understood doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, conversation by conversation, moment by moment, trust by trust. The deepest relationships aren't built on complete understanding. They're built on mutual effort, the willingness to keep learning about each other, again and again. And maybe that's why the people who feel most misunderstood often have a hidden strength. They become better listeners, more empathetic, more aware of what it feels like to be unseen, because they know how painful it is when someone misunderstands them. They become the kind of people who try harder to understand others. And in a strange way, that pain becomes wisdom. So if you've spent years feeling misunderstood, maybe it doesn't mean you're broken. Maybe it doesn't mean you're too sensitive. Maybe it doesn't mean nobody cares. Perhaps it simply means your inner world is larger and more complex than most people realize. And perhaps the answer isn't finding someone who understands everything. Perhaps the answer is finding people who are willing to understand a little more each day. Because sometimes, the people who feel misunderstood aren't impossible to understand. They're simply waiting for someone who is willing to listen. If you've ever felt misunderstood, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring psychology, human behavior, and the hidden patterns shaping how people think, feel, and act, consider subscribing, because sometimes your mind is playing you.